The next session is not obviously related to the previous one. Actually, there are not two but three speakers. The third one is Philippe Etienne, former Ambassador of France to the US, former Sherpa of President Macron for the G7 and the G20. Thank you, Philippe. Tu es très visible, c'est magnifique l'endroit où tu es. And we are going to have a discussion on the G7. The reason is, perhaps we could close the door, please. Thank you very much. The reason is that there is an interest in the G7 because it has the reputation of being small and beautiful on the one hand. By the way, it was founded by President Giscard d'Estaing in 1976, and on the whole has been relatively successful along the years. Today, many countries would like to join the G7. By the way, Russia was for a few years a member. It was called then the G8. But in fact, talking about enlarging the G7 raises at least two questions, basic questions. The first one is, what is the real purpose of the G7? What does it aim to achieve? What is its legitimacy in terms of participants? What is its efficiency? These are the kind of questions that has to be answered before we talk about enlargement. And to discuss these issues, so we have, I mentioned Philippe Etienne at first, because as I recall, the G7 was a French creation. That was a G6 at the time, G5 actually, and G6. So perhaps Philippe will help us to put this in a historical perspective. We have Hye-min, who is a diplomat, a Korean diplomat. Korea would like, or some Koreans would like to become, Korea to become a member of the G7. Hye-min is specialized, is a great expert on economic diplomacy. He has a great experience, particularly on the G20. And we have Gary Litman, who is vice chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce. And I think his role in this panel is to tell us what the American business community expects from an institution like that one. By the way, I mentioned France twice. I mentioned it the third time because France will be in charge of the G7 in the year 2026. So I think this G7 issue is an interesting segment of the whole global economic governance issue. So let us start with Philippe.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, but not enough.
Yes.
A bit stronger would be better.
Better.
So
better. I will start with, as you wished, Thierry, a small historical presentation, but I would like also to switch to the present time and to try to answer your questions. The origin of the G7 was really aimed to create an informal get-together of a small number of leaders. And at that time, the issues were mostly about the international economy, oil prices and oil shock, and also monetary conditions and coordination of monetary policies. The scope of the G7 meetings has been very much extended, and quickly enough extended to foreign policy and security policy, but also more recently to global affairs. Now, today, the G7 has a lowered legitimacy in terms of what it represents in the world. At the beginning, it was more than 60% of the GDP in the world. Now it's maybe something like 40. At the beginning, it was 20% of the global population. Now it is 10%. And also the other big difference is that the world has really very much changed in terms of international governance. The international governance as a whole is in a disarray, is in a difficult condition. And of the crisis, of course, which occurred recently, we have got the G20. It is interesting to note that just before the G20, in the years leading to the G20, we had a number of attempts, like the so-called Heiligendamm process, to associate to the G7 the most important emerging countries. And then we had the G20 created in the conditions everybody knows. So now we see the G7, which regularly practices what we call the outreach. Even if we have the G20, the G7 is inviting regularly leaders from other countries. And I will try to use here my experience as a G7 and G20 Sherpa, which I was in 3 years, 2017, 2018, 2019, to contribute to your debate with a small reflection of what makes today the legitimacy and the efficiency of a G7. I think what remains from the beginning is the informality of the meetings between the leaders. In Biarritz in 2019, our president said, I was his Sherpa, he said to me, I don't want to spend my time on negotiating long conclusions. I want a really, like it was meant at the beginning, a really private discussion between the leaders. And it is what happened. If you see the conclusions from 2019, they are very, very, very short, very different from usual conclusions. The second important thing to be able to be efficient is the unity. To have leaders who are able, having similar goals, representing countries which share basic features and values, to agree on what they want to achieve. But I would say immediately after that, that another condition, and it might seem a bit contradictory, but it is not, it is complementary, is being able of a strong unity, still not being in a block, in a situation of building a block against another block of countries. And this is the reason why what we call the outreach, which is probably not enough today, is really important. And here again, I will give the example of what we did in Biarritz. We did not only invite countries, not non-members of the G7, to take part to an informal discussion, but we also made it possible for them to prepare the meetings with them. So they have had their own Sherpas, and we have had sectoral conclusions in different sessions with those countries. One important case for us was Africa. We had a session devoted to Africa with a special outreach for African countries. And I think it is a very important case, even if Africa is now represented in the G20, even through the African Union. And the last thing I want to add is for the efficiency and the legitimacy of the G7 is to get concrete results. I will take the examples of the last two summits. I will mention the Hiroshima principles on artificial intelligence, which is a very important result, which is one of the building blocks on which the international community is trying to build a common view on how to see the development of artificial intelligence. And more recently, we had a very important decision on the 7 countries to support Ukraine with a concrete decision on financial support. But again, if you look at the big topics covered by the G7 and the G20, you see a lot of commonalities. You see the global subjects. You see, including climate and biodiversity. You see food security. You see the fight against inequalities. You see, as I said, artificial intelligence and the digital developments, and how to avoid a divide in the world in those new technologies, in the capacity to use those new technologies. So my conclusion here, and I will be happy to take part to the debate, for the way forward, is that the G7 needs to keep this informality, this possibility to have a common deliberation of leaders on the most important problems of the time, but also to be able, through working with other countries, and I leave open the different possibilities. You mentioned enlargement, for instance, of the G7, or different kinds of outreach or better outreach, the capacity to contributing to the global discussion and to bringing their own solutions to the global discussion.
Thank you very much, Philippe.
May I stop here?
Yeah. Thank you very much. Well, for the time being, yes. But thank you very much. And now I give the floor to Hye-min to give a Korean viewpoint, but it will in fact be much wider than Korea. Please, Hye-min.
Merci Thierry. Je suis très heureux d'être ici cet après-midi. Je tiens à remercier tout d'abord Thierry et son équipe.
S'il parle français, alors moi j'aurais dû parler coréen. J'aurais dû parler coréen.
Toujours, c'est mon grand plaisir de parler en français, but I would like to turn to English. I think we need to talk about the G20 as well in order to talk about the G7. See, G7 and G20 are a group of countries that meet for mainly macroeconomic policy coordination in view of its necessity and importance. G20, G7 have significant influence on the global economy, but both G7 and G20 are informal entities. Traditional and formally structured international governance institutions are established and based on a founding charter or international treaty, such as Charter of United Nations or Articles of Agreement of International Monetary Fund. But as you can see, G7 and G20 are not formed by such official agreements. Therefore, G7 and G20, from the beginning, lacked the legitimacy afforded to such international organizations like United Nations or IMF. Nobody has asked them to discuss and decide on such an important global economic issues. And more importantly, G7 and G20 declarations or documents carry no legal obligations and cannot be enforced. I think Thierry already mentioned, and Ambassador Etienne, I don't know whether he remembers me or not, we were the G20 Sherpa at the same time in Hamburg G20 summit meeting. I know that. And then you see the G7, by the welcoming Canada in 2076, it has become G7. It's the initiation of French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. See, it's a French and European ideas. And it's understood that they have shared views on values, including the respect for human rights, rule of law, and a commitment to market economies. Over the time, the G20 focus on macroeconomic policies expanded to a variety of other global issues, including security, foreign policy, climate change, and terrorism, among others. And with the increasing economic growth of emerging economies, its share in the global GDP continued to decrease from 61% in 1980 to 52% in 2008. I refer to 2008 because that's the year when the global financial crisis took place. When the global financial crisis broke out in the fall 2008, it was not possible for only G7 members to deal with this crisis. And the G20 leaders then convened for the first time in Washington, D.C. in November 2008 as a leaders' meeting. The G20 leaders declared next year, in 2009, in Pittsburgh, that G20 would be the premier forum for international economic cooperation and has become major actor in global governance, in fact, replacing G7. G20 has since stabilized the world economy, successfully overcoming the 2008 financial crisis through active macroeconomic policy coordination among its members. It was also very instrumental in concluding the Paris Climate Change Agreement in 2015 at COP21 and its early entry into force in 2016. However, as you can see, the recent 3 G20 summit in Bali, New Delhi, and Rio demonstrate that G20 could no longer have any meaningful impact on global issues because of breakdown of global cooperation mechanism caused mainly by intensifying US-China conflict and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In this backdrop, G7 has regained its importance by mostly coordinating the West sanctions on Russia. However, its continued lack of representativeness in the global economy, whereby the G7's share in the global GDP has dropped to 30% last year, compared to 85% of G20. This reduced share in the global GDP of the G7 limit the role of the G7 as a global governance entity. It remains uncertain how G7 can increase its representativeness without affecting its efficiency. See? when G20 was first established in 1999, after the Asian financial crisis, at the finance minister and central bank governors level, the intent was to include systematically significant countries that are able to contribute to global economic and financial stability. And this number 20 and composition were as a striking a careful balance between representativeness and efficacy. The conflict of representativeness versus efficiency has been an enduring concern for G7 as well as for G20. It will continue. On the one hand, G7 and G20 as major actors of global governance must include all significant countries as members. But on the other hand, they must consider risk of reduced efficacy if the numbers exceed a certain limit. This is an unavoidable dilemma. In case of eventual expansion of the membership, the G20 and G7, it must do so in a way to supplement their lack of legitimacy. In addition, expanding agenda of the G7 and G20 is another problem, posing the challenge of staying within capacity of taking leadership on all major global issues. G20's communique, G20 leaders' communique for this year is 36 pages. And Italy has hosted throughout the year 23 ministerial meetings, each producing a long declaration. Similarly, the G20 leaders' declaration, Rio, for this year is 22 pages. And Brazil hosted more than 100 meetings of ministers, working groups, task force, and engagement group meetings. Finally, here comes President Trump. I think you all remember what he said in May 2020. He said G7 is an outdated group of countries. See? Since he took office, I heard the Sherpas of G7 and G20 had difficulty in producing draft leaders' declaration, mainly due to his dislike of the climate change language and multilateral trading system. I participated in the Hamburg G20 summit meeting of 2017 as Korea Sherpa, and G20 leaders' declaration always contained the expression of support for multilateral trading system. But in Hamburg, the US Sherpa opposed the expression of multilateral trading system. We asked him why. His answer was, Trump doesn't like it. He instead proposed international trading system. So, if you see the Hamburg leaders' declaration, it contained term international trading system in place of multilateral trading system. And I checked this year's G20 leaders' declaration. It came back to support a multilateral trading system. The America First policy does not appreciate the value of alliance and partners. So I expect the vitality of G7 and G20 would be significantly reduced. The leadership role of the United States in G20 and G7 may be also very different in the years to come. This will be a challenge to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hye-min. You're very popular here. And now so that was a very interesting and exhaustive also viewpoint. Now I will ask Gary, who is not vice chairman, but a senior vice president, so I correct in passing, to give a very concrete view of what the business community in the US is expecting from such a body, if any, if you expect anything, or do you expect anything, and what? And I think that relating to the remarks of Hye-min, how do you think Trump, how do you think about the way Trump thinks about these kind of organizations? Apparently, he doesn't seem to be very interested.
Well, thank you, Thierry. Thank you for inviting me. It's fascinating to listen to real insiders for G7 and G20 process, and what I can do is to offer an outsider's view. The business community represented by the US Chamber of Commerce, the largest business advocacy group in the United States, started paying attention to G7 around 2007. And the first thing we did was to call on our counterparts in France, in MEDEF, Canada, Germany, Japan, Italy, and the European Union, and UK, which was then in the European Union, as we recall. We shared the same feeling of unease in 2007. If you remember, at that time, there was a lot of tension, political tension, between Washington, Paris, and Berlin. Some people insisted on renaming French fries in the cafeterias of the greatest deliberating body in the United States. We felt that at the peak of globalization, when we looked at each other as competitors but also partners, the governments were trying to pull us apart and wrap us into national flags and say that, you know, you're an American company, you have to behave this way, you're a French company, you have to be this way, etc. And that's not the way the businesses we represented felt. So we decided to get together and have a private meeting of leaders of the largest business lobbies and find out whether we have something in common and what we can do to help our companies keep gaining the economies of scale through globalization. So 2007, we had our first meeting and we formed Business 7. And a year later, financial crisis started and we saw the elevation of G20, and we decided to keep our eye on G7 process for the simple reason. We did not calculate the share of GDP, we did not look at the numbers, we had a very simple strategy. These are rule makers. Rule makers are getting together and creating rules, or at least a shared analysis of what's right and wrong in our economies, and they are not asking the actual actors in these economies, business community, their opinion about the future. We wanted G7 to offer a shared narrative of economic growth coming out of the financial crisis in economies where most of our multinationals are based, pay their taxes, develop their innovation, where their bankers are based, and we were completely shut out of the process. G20, as Ambassador said, became more important on many levels during the financial crisis. It begat some institutions like the Financial Stability Board and others, and we paid a lot of attention to that, so we formed a parallel group, Business 20, but we kept the 7 for the same reason, regulatory power. And as you have all seen, in the wake of the financial crisis, the states got a lot more influence, a lot more self-assuredness, I would say, that they know how to manage crises, they know how economies should work, they know how to set the rules, and they saw many companies fail. Some of the leading companies fail in 2008, 2011. Many companies had to be bailed. So the governments felt that they are in charge, and they were. But for us in the private sector, that was a completely different universe compared to 2007. So we still look at G7 with the same eyes. There is a difference. I must tell you that there is a lot more interest right now in the business community about G7, starting with the German presidency, what, 2 years ago? When we realized that G20 was reflecting the dysfunctionalities of geopolitics, and G7 is regaining or consolidating its influence over international institutions, over rules of the financial markets, rules over industrial policies, not even rules, not in the legal terms, but the shared way of describing global problems, the shared language of describing capacities and limitations of governments and private sector, the shared difficulties of generating growth in our mature economies. And that's why we started paying a lot more attention to meetings of G7 principals, but also ministers. If you think about this, throughout the year, the ministers and deputy ministers of energy, transport, tourism, finance, health, keep meeting together with no private sector being there, and precisely because these are not treaty-based fora, they frequently bypass the normal process. They get involved, the staff, as they wish, and that creates, flexibility, but also lack of transparency. So all the more reason for the private sector to be interested and try to insert ourselves. And we did, and last year, the Italian presidency under Prime Minister Meloni was exceptionally eager to engage private sector in all of the ministerial meetings, as long as the key conversation was about digital economy. So we had our bandwidth, and we were involved, and that's why it was particularly interesting. So it is, the expectation from G7 is that it will keep setting the narrative in this world where content is king, frankly, and politicians respond to what's being phrased by others and pick up that narrative. Even today, at the opening session, you saw political and religious leaders echoing what was said by G7 10 years ago about climate, inclusivity, etc. These were the words that were introduced by G7, and they're still working. Although political cycles have turned, new presidents, new prime minister, President Trump, will walk into the same meeting, but more importantly, all of his staff will walk into those interagency meetings, and they will have to speak that language. They will have to understand what the history is. They may not like it, they may like it, doesn't matter. They're there for 4 years. G7 has been around. But they will have to understand what's going on. And that's really the reason private sector is very keen to be involved. This year, the presidency is Canada, next France. I don't know whether that fits your middle power definition, Thierry. And then the United States. And France will be chairing G7 when the United States chairs G20. I can assure you that business community will be working together. We won't read all those thousands of pages. We'll have our very narrow interests, finding those areas where governments may help or impede economic growth. And that's where companies will direct their representatives and others to focus and find ways for politicians to listen. That's really all we see from outside. And last point about G7, we'd hate to see G7 being defined by what it's not. It should not be defined by what BRICS is doing. It should be defined by what G7 is doing for its own citizens, its own businesses, and do the best it can. In terms of expansion, we'll leave that to politicians. but governments that set the rules for large markets, we want to interact with them individually, and we want to be part of any of their collective endeavors.
Thank you very much, Gary. So time is always our problem. We have 7 minutes and 43, 42, 41, 40 seconds. So I think the best perhaps we could do would be to ask each of the 3 speakers to spend 2 minutes on what they take from the other speakers, okay? So we will start, because after all, good conversations are conversations after which each one has modified at least slightly his or her viewpoints. So we'll start with Philippe. Pas plus de 2 minutes. Hein?
Well, I think I was as short as possible in my introduction, and I will take from the last intervention. The business community is one of our most important partners in these G7 summits. And also the fact that what the leaders decide is important for the economy, about the way we shape the conditions, the framework conditions for the economy. This is really important. And when I spoke about concrete conclusions, I meant also this dimension. And I think the business community, but also the social partners, have to be beyond the engagement groups, actively asked and interact with the leaders on the margins of these summits. And from my Korean colleague, and I remember our night, do you remember the night of discussions and negotiating the conclusions in Hamburg? And of course, he's completely right to say that there is a dilemma between the number of people in the room and the efficiency of your process. On the president of the elect president of the United States, he recalled also what happened. What we have been doing during the first mandate by President Trump on the climate was indeed to say that there was a disagreement, and we have arranged our conclusions in a way that everybody could see his position respected. But it did not prevent us to try to work in other domains on what we wanted to achieve. I remember the first summit with Donald Trump was in Taormina in Italy. There just had been a terrible terrorist attacks, and in the UK, I think it was in Manchester, and we succeeded also to have a united conversation on this fight against terrorism. So it is always possible to find domains where we want to act together, even if there will be some points where we accept to disagree, even important like the fight against climate change and the Paris Climate Agreement.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Hye-min?
I think Ambassador Etienne stressed the importance of informality and responsibility of the G7 groupings. But as I mentioned in my presentation, it conflicts with their legitimacy, you see. Who have ever asked them to do it in an informal way? It is related to the point raised by Mr. Litman, transparency. You know, especially the business world or the academics, people want to know how this kind of decision has made by leaders. So I think that is the big questions.
Merci beaucoup. Gary?
Well, all I can say is that, you know, we see the power of the state growing from crisis to crisis, and having informal fora like G7, G20, where personalities are sometimes more visible than the institutions, seems to be a sign of the times. So in a way, we feel that G7 and G20 remain very relevant as signals how those personalities can work together and overcome or not institutional challenges and find new ways of talking to the markets, to the private sector, and work together, because they have to deal with global problems that are not going away just because personalities differ. So we're not going to be reading every comma in every paper that will be produced, but it does not mean that these four are not insignificant. And they don't take away from established institutions like the World Bank or WTO, OECD, IMF. They have their own life, but they have extraordinary staff and path dependency, because these are real institutions. They ground the conversations. But I'm afraid that we're entering the moment when personalities will matter more, and that will just compel us to pay more attention to these informal meetings.
Well, thank you very much, Gary. Thank you very much to the three speakers. I think it was an interesting discussion, a lot of food for thought. Unfortunately, as always, we don't have time to go as far as we would like, but I remember a French politician who told me once that after a meal, after a good meal, it's better to stop when being still a little bit hungry. It's the same for discussions, So we will have other opportunities to deepen these sort of questions, which also fit very well with the agenda of the World Policy Conference. So merci beaucoup à tous, je ne dirais pas à toutes.
Merci.
Et maintenant, on continue une autre table ronde. Merci.